thanks very much. So I am very pleased to be here. Actually, as Philippa said, I was listening to her language. She said, and I'm a very old supporter. Maybe I'm moderately old supporter. But anyway, I've always been enthusiastic about reading because we know how attitudes changed to cancer and attitudes changed to AIDS. And that wasn't mostly through the professionals, that was through the advocates and the charities going out and campaigning. And we know how attitudes, stigma to mental illness has decreased. Again, that's not been through professionals, that's been through the work of Rethink and other charities. So there are many things that charities like Rethink can do that the professionals can't do, especially in this age when it's quite difficult for professionals to step out of line and say, you know, what needs to be done in their hospital or their trust because some manager will come and threaten them. So it's often better to come from you. So anyway, I thought I was asked to talk for about 20-25 minutes and then leave plenty of time for questions. So if I go on too long, stop me. I'll try. But I think there's no doubt that when I came into psychiatry, people said schizophrenia was a mystery. It was an enigma. We didn't know the causes of it. Now we do know the causes. There's still a lot to learn, but we know both the genetic and some of the environmental factors that push people into psychosis. And perhaps the biggest change in research has been in the genetics. For ages and ages there's been this argument, is there a genetic component to schizophrenia? And we now know not only that there is, but we know a lot of the genes that are involved. And this paper was published in 2014, and it was a huge cooperative effort. So this is a study of 35,000 people with schizophrenia and nearly 50,000 control subjects who didn't have schizophrenia. So this actually there are probably a number of people here who contributed their blood, because people contributed their blood to groups like us, and we sent it off to the DNA off to the USA, and all the analysis was carried out together. And essentially, this is called a Manhattan plot. So it's because it looks a bit like Manhattan, you can think of all these as little skyscrapers. And these, along the bottom are the different chromosomes. So here's chromosome 1, this one with a big peak on it is chromosome 6, and up to chromosome 20, and so on. And all these little peaks are areas where they found the gene which is linked to schizophrenia. So there are lots of them. At one point it was sort of thought that maybe 99 people out of 100 didn't have any genetic predisposition to schizophrenia, and 1% did. But now we know that all these genes, that we all have we're all walking about with susceptibility genes for psychosis and for schizophrenia. It's just that some people have more than most of us. But these are genes involved in brain function. And so I was at the conference when this was first announced, and the audience, this was at the Hamburg Genetics Conference in 2014, the audience was so pleased by this that they stood up and cheered in the middle of the lecture talk. I'm not expecting that we'll do this today, but it's an indication as to how important it has been. And it's important not only for researchers, but here you can see, here are people in Scotland, they're out and about, they're saying, oh dear, we didn't get independence, Jimmy, but never mind, there's 108 genes for schizophrenia. So there's lots of, it's not that you get a tiny, all these little genes just increase your risk by a tiny amount. And so you need quite a number of them to be predisposed to have schizophrenia. It's just a bit like Some people are predisposed to be tall, or some people are predisposed to be short, some people are predisposed a little bit to have asthma, or that diabetes tends to run in the family. It doesn't mean for sure you're going to get it. It just means you're a little bit more likely to get to develop an illness if particular things happen to you in life. So the sort of genes that are involved, one is the dopamine receptor gene. Now, what psychiatrists spend their days doing is prescribing drugs which block the dopamine receptor. So it's interesting that one of the genes which is involved is a gene that controls this dopamine receptor that is so important in that we try to block with antipsychotics. And then also there's been a long argument as to whether psychosis, and when I say I go from talking about psychosis and talking about schizophrenia, schizophrenia in my view is just more severe psychosis. You can have psychosis that lasts for 2 or 3 days, or psychosis that lasts for a month. We tend to use the term schizophrenia when it's been more severe or it's lasted longer. But so I'll flip from talking about one to talking about another. So there's been the question as to whether stress can precipitate psychosis. Of course, I think everybody accepts that this is the case, but some of the genes that are involved in the way you respond to stress or the way you respond to infection. And similarly, there's been a long discussion about some people who develop psychosis, maybe about a quarter or a third. Most people who develop psychosis have been fine as children, but maybe a quarter or a third have had a lot of troubles as children. And this seems to reflect that in some cases there's been some of the genes involved in brain development have been subtly awry. So the sort of genes that are coming out as being important in psychosis are they're reinforcing some of the views that we've had about psychosis for a long time. So it's not that this is going to immediately lead to new treatments, but it does mean that we know much better what direction to look. And the other thing is, now we know that there's more than 100 genes involved, little genes that people who develop psychosis have more than the rest of us, but most of us have some of these genes. You could sort of think that, this could apply to lots of things. This could be, this could apply to height. You could have short people here, average height people here, and tall people here, or this could be blood pressure. You could have people with low blood pressure, people with average blood pressure, and people with high blood pressure. And once it goes over a certain point, then you need to have treatment. And it's a bit like that with psychosis. So here's the average person. Here's people with a very little liability to psychosis. Over here, quite a proportion of people who never see psychiatrists have some psychotic symptoms. That they might hear a voice, or symptoms that psychiatrists would say psychotic. They might hear a voice. They might hear, for example, their dead mum talking to them. And if she's saying nice, encouraging, positive things, then they're never going to go and see a psychiatrist about it. Or they might say, I think that their neighbour was deliberately trying to interfere with them. These sort of minor equivalents of some of the symptoms that people have. So these would be people who might be over here. But if you cross a certain threshold, then you get regarded as having a psychotic illness. Of course, there are people at this other end who are quite interesting, because they're people who have very little liability to paranoia, which is a very bad thing. My wife, I always think, is down here. This causes us lots of trouble, because she's always wanting to give her money away to people she meets in the street that I think look like drug dealers. Or she's leaving the front door open, because you need, it's a good thing to have a little bit of paranoia, particularly if you live in a big city. Actually, it's probably not a good idea to walk about London with your wallet in your back pocket. And in normal life, you have to sort of be a little cautious. And I don't know if any of you know the Scottish legend about the Campbells and the McDonalds. Maybe some of you do. that the McDonald's were one clan and lived in one area, and the Campbells came to visit them. And they stayed for 2 weeks, and the McDonald's gave them food and everything. And then the 14th, I think it was the 14th night, the Campbells woke up in the middle of the night and cut the throats of all the McDonald's. It's a bit of an exaggeration, but the trouble with McDonald's must have been too far down here. If there'd been one or two of them who were a bit more paranoid, they would have said, why are these Campbells coming and imposing themselves on us? So you can see that even paranoia has a little bit of paranoia is a good thing. Too much is a little bit of suspiciousness, I should say. So schizophrenia is really just severe psychosis, and we can now think of it as, you can think again, this could be people with low anxiety, medium anxiety, or high anxiety. So we've got used to anxiety and depression being at the end of a continuum. For a long time we thought that schizophrenia was different, but now we know it's just one end of a continuum. People with psychosis are not like men from Mars. They're not totally non-understandable. They're just like the rest of us, but with more particular problems. So we know a bit more about the genetics. What do we know about the factors? For lots of illnesses, you don't talk about. If you think about heart disease, people don't talk about much about the causes of heart disease. We talk about the risk factors, like having a family history, or smoking cigarettes, or getting obese and not taking exercise. All these things increase your risk of heart disease, and it's the same with psychosis and schizophrenia. We know that children who are premature, or children who had a very difficult birth, that their risk is increased, probably because this affects the cortex of the brain as it's developing. Childhood adversity, children who've lost a parent, or children who've had a range of other adversities are more likely to have an increased risk of maybe about 10% of people who develop psychosis have had a particularly difficult childhood. Being a migrant, so it's well established that people who migrate from one country to another country are more prone to develop psychosis in the country to which they come. And that's understandable, because when you're in a culture that you don't totally understand, or you don't feel totally part of, you're more prone to suspiciousness. If you think, would you buy a second-hand car in Greece? It's difficult to buy a second-hand car. You're wondering, is this guy conning you, and so on. But at least in England, in Britain, you have some sort of idea. You think, well, maybe he is trustworthy. But if you're in Poland, or if you're in France or Greece, how would you judge whether the second-hand car salesman was trying to con you or not? So
dangerous ground, yeah.
Which particular country? Yes.
Greece, I was thinking of.
Yes. Well, would you buy a second-hand car in Scotland? Who thinks Scottish? Particularly known to be very mean and difficult. Or again, if you go on holiday and you get a taxi from the airport, after how many minutes do you begin to think, this taxi man thinks I'm an idiot? I'm sure I've seen that building before. For me, it's about 6 or 7 minutes before I start wondering, is this guy conning me? So being a migrant increases your risk. Being brought up in an inner city increases the risk. Nobody quite knows why, but maybe it's something to do with the fact you can become socially isolated and get less social support in the inner city. And of course, adverse life events. And it's not so much losses. If your girlfriend leaves you, or your husband dies, or you lose your job, you're more likely to become depressed. But it's threatening events. If you're bullied, if you're attacked in the street, or if your house is burgled, these are the sort of things that are particularly bullying. Persistent threatening adversity tends to increase risk. And there's certainly it's not uncommon for someone like me to meet people who hallucinate, who still hear the voices of the boys who bullied them at school. And so these kind of events can precipitate a psychosis. And of course, drug abuse. This is the biggest and perhaps the most important factor, at least in London. This is a study that we did, particularly Martha de Forti, and this is, I don't know if you can see this, but this is the risk of psychosis if you don't take cannabis, and this is the risk of psychosis if you take different types of cannabis. So this would be the risk if you take hashish or hash or resin, old-fashioned cannabis, and you can see that it doesn't really increase your risk. Almost look protective, but that's not significant. But it's if you use skunk, so high-potency cannabis. Called skunk because of the smell, the stronger smell. If you're using high-potency cannabis every day, then your risk of psychosis goes up about 5 times. So in South London, about a quarter of all the people that we see who have psychosis would not have developed it if they had not been using high-potency cannabis. So we actually know how to get rid of a quarter. Well, in theory, we know how we could get rid of a quarter of all the people that we see with psychosis in South London. That if people were not smoking this high-potency cannabis. Old-fashioned cannabis it's a bit like saying if you drink lager, well, it is possible to become alcoholic drinking lager. You have to try very hard and drink vast quantities of it. It's much easier to become alcoholic if you're drinking vodka or whiskey. And it's the same, that skunk is in a sense the sort of cannabis equivalent of vodka or whiskey. So we know that this is a really important factor, and if we could educate people to avoid the heavy use of high-potency cannabis, this would be a great thing to do. Now, I talked about dopamine before, and one of the things that we now know is that a lot of the factors that increase the risk of psychosis are actually messing up your dopamine system. So, for example, here are people who are stressed. These are people who have nothing to do with psychosis. Here are people in the prodrome, or what's called the at-risk net, people who are just teetering on the brink of possibly going psychotic. And here are people with schizophrenia, and they're given a psychological stress test, which is called the Montreal stress test. And this is a really cunning and nasty test, where they take a group of people like this and say, we're going to give you arithmetic to do, and at the end of it, they'll put a list of how you all scored, including our chairs and the speaker. So you'll all know how we do in terms of the arithmetic. And then you start doing it, and then every third or fourth answer you give, they say, that's wrong. And then they rush on. They don't, and it's coming so quick, you know, that you say, what's 2 times 5? And you say 10, they say wrong. And then you're on to the next question. You think, was it really wrong? But then you're getting more and more questions, and you're getting more and more stressed. Then a voice says, you're doing really badly. Everybody else is doing better than you are. You are the worst. Please try harder. So you get worse and you try harder, and they still tell you you're wrong. So there's a very good test for releasing dopamine, because you get a bit panic-stricken and think, my God, I'm going to be absolute bottom of this. What are people going to think of me? So this is ordinary people, just plucked from the community, given this and this test. And this is, I don't know, you probably can't see it, there's a very faint blue there, and that's the increase in dopamine that's released, and this happens to people. But here are people who are teetering on the brink of psychosis, not quite psychotic. You can see they're releasing more dopamine. And here are people who have got a diagnosis of schizophrenia, and they're releasing more dopamine. So one of the things about people who develop psychosis is that when they're stressed, they release more of the dopamine. And in many ways, it's the excess of dopamine that leads people to develop symptoms. You know about, what is dopamine for? Dopamine is often thought to be the pleasure chemical, but it also grabs your attention. So if you're watching telly and your lottery number comes up, dopamine. Or if you're watching telly and some terrible crash occurs and you're worried about whether a relative might be involved, this would release dopamine. So dopamine grabs your attention. If you're running on too much dopamine, then all sorts of things seem significant. All sorts of insignificant things. And I always like to see, I mean, how many people, how many red cars, think to yourself, how many red cars did you notice on the way to the hotel today? Anybody?
20.
Is that 2?
20.
20? Well, wow. Are you sure of that now?
No.
But most of us don't remember because it's not really significant. But if you're running on too much dopamine, you might think red means danger. Why are all these red cars follow me? Why is the chap with the camera? Why is he wearing red? You might begin to become suspicious that people either wearing red or coming in red cars might be part of a conspiracy. So the excess of dopamine makes your surroundings seem different, and people, perhaps their facial expressions might seem more threatening or more to do with you. Everything seems more important, so that when the newsreader comes on the television, they look at you, you think they're talking about you or talking to you. So this is all mediated by dopamine, and if you stress people, then this is more likely to happen. So you can have a situation a bit like this. So people who are liable to psychosis have a dopamine system that reacts to stress more dramatically. So if they have some acute psychosocial stress, they release dopamine, and this causes these strange symptoms. And if you've had a difficult life and you've had a whole series of problems, you might begin to blame other people for this, and you might interpret these strange things happening in the environment in a paranoid way. And then you might then go on to develop psychosis. Now, once you've developed psychosis itself is very stressful, because you think the man down the road is trying to do you harm, or the CIA are trying to interfere with your brain, or your parents are trying to poison you. So the illness itself causes more stress, which causes more release of dopamine, which causes more paranoia, and so on. So eventually, after a while, people get so ill that they might perhaps, for example, be sectioned. That's being sectioned is enormously stressful. That some person you don't know comes to your house and says you have to come into hospital, and then you don't agree, and then ambulance men or even the police come, and so you think they're all ganging up on you, and this increases the dopamine further and makes you. So you get into a vicious circle of more stress causing more dopamine release, causing more psychotic experiences, and so on. And of course, what psychiatrists do is try to block the dopamine here with antipsychotics. Often we can find some way of reducing the stress, the psychosocial stress, and psychologists try and help people to alter the way they think about their experiences by CBT and these sort of means. So I think we have a good understanding of how psychosis happens, and I haven't had time to talk about treatment, but let me just say one thing. We followed up nearly 400 people for the diagnosis of first episode psychosis, and at 10 years, 60% had no psychotic symptoms. So I was very pleased. So 40% still had, that wasn't enough. 46% had no psychotic symptoms for 2 years. 40% of those with a diagnosis of schizophrenia. Now, half of these people who got a diagnosis of schizophrenia and who were well were still taking antipsychotics. But 19% of people eventually got off antipsychotics. So people often say they'll have to stay them on for life. And the answer is not necessarily. That you have to stay on them for now, but it may be that in a year or two we'll be able to reduce them just a little bit and very, very cautiously. So, but some people definitely, so the outlook is much better than it used to be thought that schizophrenia, psychosis is a deteriorating illness. We can do a lot to prevent that. And a minority of people will be sufficiently well to be able to come off their antipsychotics and still have no symptoms. And I'll stop at that point, and I'm happy to answer questions.